Dr. Jay Odenbaugh. Jay is an associate professor and the department chair of philosophy at the Lewis and Clark State College in Portland, Oregon. He received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Calgary, and his research interests include the history and philosophy of science, especially ecology and evolution, metaphysics, ethics, and aesthetics. And so it's been nice to have some focused talk this morning on some research application, and kind of nice to switch over to some ethical stuff. So let's please welcome Jay.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Can everybody hear me all right? Is that, if it gets feedback here or whatever, let me know. So today, what I want to do is talk about sort of the ethical side of assisted migration, some of the ethical issues that are raised. And so what I want to do is begin with a moral dilemma. And sometimes when philosophers talk about moral dilemmas, another term they use is moral tragedy. And so what I want to try to do is identify what seems to be a really deep problem in thinking about assisted migration. And like a good philosopher, hopefully, I'm going to present you a problem and then try to walk ourselves out of it and find a way to resolve it. And hopefully, as a result of today, I've given you just some conceptual tools to think about some of the ethical issues that are raised by assisted migration. So first, I'll present the dilemma. Then what I want to do is talk about species extinction and sort of ethical issues with regard to that. Then talk about invasive species. I participated in a variety of workshops on assisted migration, and friends of mine who are ecologists, I'm thinking of a particular paleoecologist, have a certain problem with assisted migration, and a way of putting it is that it seems like an instance of playing God. And so I want to talk about that worry and then just conclude. I'm sure as all of you or most of you know that things don't look so good from the point of view of climate change. Projections being what they are, it seems that something like between 10,000 and 30,000 species are going extinct per year, as compared to a background rate of about one species per million years. That projection is based on species area curves, which have to do with things like deforestation and so on. That's not including climate change. Right? These are model projections, but nevertheless, that's the sort of thing, if you read E.O. Wilson, for example, you'll hear said. Thomas et al. In 2004 had a paper on climate change and biodiversity loss in which they say, quote, "We predict on the basis of mid-range climate warming scenarios for 2050 that between 15 and 37% of species in our sample of regions and taxa will be committed to extinction." That's on top of that projection I just mentioned. Things don't look good. So now I'm going to make it worse in a way. So I just want to, in philosophers, we try to sort of work through issues sort of step by step. And so I just want to lay out some ideas in a kind of sequential way. So many of us have the conviction that there's something morally wrong about driving a species to extinction. And in fact, you can think about, much of our legislation and so on encodes that moral duty to prevent extinction when we can. Additionally, and more recently, many of us also think that it's morally wrong to create invasive species. So at Lewis and Clark College, where I teach, it's pretty common for students to have ivy pools, right? Because they think they have a duty to remove exotic or invasive species so that native flora and fauna are present and only them. Well, if you take those two obligations and you consider the strategy of assisted migration, we have the third idea, that human-induced climate change will cause species to go extinct unless we relocate those species to areas outside their native range. If you're a strong proponent of assisted migration, you might think that one of our best tools, maybe our only tool, if things get excessively bad, extremely bad, would be to use the strategy of assisted migration. And then we're left with the sort of moral tragedy or the real worry. So therefore, we're either causing species to go extinct or we're creating exotic species. Regardless, we're doing something morally wrong. The idea being damned if you do, damned if you don't. And so what I want to try to do today is think kind of piece by piece through this, and maybe we can find a way to make it seem not so hopeless. Ethics is incredibly complicated, as you know from firsthand experience, but for those of us who spend our time trying to think about it from a kind of theoretical perspective, I'm just going to sketch kind of where I'm going to start from, and then we can add details or wrinkles as we go. Today what I want to do is sort of start from an idea in ethics is that you can evaluate actions in terms of their consequences. And when, ethicists throughout, history think about how do we determine what we should do, there are really sort of three things they go to, and I'm just going to use one of them as my starting point. So you might try to evaluate what you should do in terms of the consequence or the effects of your actions, and ask, will those effects be, harmful, beneficial, and etc. In moral discussions, other people sort of zero in on not just the consequences of actions, but the nature of the act itself. So someone might say, it's wrong to lie, not just because of the effects of the lying, but lying itself is wrong because it's disrespectful to the person that I'm deceiving. Or to use a more extreme case, when ethicists talk about things like torture, they'll talk about the wrongness of torture not merely being in the effects it has, but the kind of disrespect it shows to someone by treating them in that way. Kant talked about that. Immanuel Kant talked about this as treating someone as a mere means and not as an end in themselves. The last thing that ethicists talk about is the kinds of intentions that lie behind why you act the way you do. So if I make a promise to you, but insincerely, the fact that I intended to not really keep my word shines some ethical light on what I've done. These are different ways of trying to evaluate how we should act, and I'm just going to stick with consequences just for simplicity. So there's more to be said. So the starting assumption is going to be it's morally wrong to perform actions which we can expect to produce more harm than good. Well, when we talk about harm and we talk about benefits and so on, we have to ask, well, what are the relevant values at stake? And this is just incomplete probably, but a list of some of the values that I think that are at stake in environmental decision making, and specifically in the case of assisted migration. So the first sort of value you can think of is ecosystem health, the persistent stability or resilience of ecological communities. The notion of ecosystem health is really interesting to me because it's importing a medical notion into environmental context, and that has interesting implications. So, for example, can we really say that a given ecosystem, for example, is diseased? But that's for another day. Biodiversity, variation with respect to genes, species, ecosystems, and maybe even landscapes. Biodiversity obviously is a really important topic, and philosophers like myself have spent some time trying to figure out exactly what it is. Is it something over and above species evenness and richness, etc.? But it's important. There are what you might call anthropocentric values. These are the sort of human-centered, economic, recreational, aesthetic values we associate with ecological systems. So, it might be the case that someone defends assisted migration because it maintains a species or a assemblage of species that we particularly value because it's beautiful to us. Right? A more controversial topic or suite of values goes under the name intrinsic value. So here we're thinking about the value species have in and of themselves, not for what kind of use we can put them to, but for their own sake. My students have strong intuitions about this, right? They think that we should protect species for their own sake, not for us. It's anthropocentric to think that we are the only things that matter for and only in ourselves. And the last one is animal welfare. So if you're transplanting animals, you might think that you have an obligation to do so in the least painful way possible. And so there we're thinking about their interest, their well-being. These are just a suite of values, and so when I ask, what are the consequences of different kinds of policies or actions, these are the things about which we're considering. So let's zero in on that sort of dilemma I talked about. So as I say, my students say it's morally wrong for humans to cause a species to go extinct. Lots of my students, lots of people I know have that strong inclination. And what I want to do is sort of challenge that as being too simple. And so I'm going to come at it in a couple of different ways, but we can start here. One principle that ethicists almost uniformly accept is that ought implies can. So if you ought to do something, it has to be the sort of thing that you can actually do. So if someone blames me for a crime that's committed across town, in Northeast Portland. It's reasonable for me to say that I don't have an obligation to stop that crime because there's no way I could. I'm here, right? The crime's there. You can only be held responsible for things which you have the power to choose or avoid. So thinking about that in the environmental context, let's suppose, as conservation biologists tell us, that there's somewhere between 5 and 100 million species. Right? It's a big spread. Not all of which can be saved from extinction. Right? That's just an impossibility. If that's true, and you accept that what we ought to do requires that we can avoid it or choose it, then saving all species is impossible. Put slightly differently, that means that we don't have an obligation to save every species, some of which it's okay, you're not doing something wrong by allowing them to go extinct. Right? I don't know if that should give you comfort or not, but the sort of almost excessive optimism about saving every little piece is something that simply we can't sustain ethically. Secondly, and this is a thought I think many people who are interested in saving species have a hard time swallowing, and that's the idea that not every species matters equally from a human point of view. So ecologists often talk about the role of functional redundancy in ecosystems or ecological communities, that there can be a suite of species, each of which will carry out some, say, ecosystem service. And then so if one were to be lost, there would be some other one that would take its place and do the same job. If that's right, then not every species matters equally. Now, if you have some functional group of species that, do some ecosystem service, the more species that are lost in that group, the more likely you are to have that function not be carried out. But not every species is as useful as every other species. And if that's right, then another reason why we might not think we have a moral obligation to save every species is that, to put it sort of starkly, not every species is important. That's not an idea that many like to hear, but it might be true. The last thing I should say is that some people argue that species, are intrinsically valuable. They have value for their own sake. Another way you might put this is that some species have a right to exist. But one of the things that we've learned about the notion of rights is that rights can be trumped, right? So I have a right to free speech, but I can't just say anything I want. There are conditions under which that right can be trumped. So it stands to reason that even if species have a right to exist, that's not an absolute right. So all this is to say that one, it was just way too strong, right? The idea that we have an obligation to save every species, period, is unsustainable. So I'd rather put it this way, is that we should say it's morally wrong for humans to voluntarily cause a species to go extinct when that would produce more harm than good. Okay? And the harm and good are understood in terms of the values that we were talking about earlier. So the second idea, it's morally wrong for humans to introduce a non-native species into an area, say, in which it's not native. The first thing to note, it's really hard to get a handle on the notion of exotic or invasive species. They're defined in multiple ways, not always consistently. So here are a couple of different ways of thinking about what makes a species exotic or invasive. So let me just kind of read through these. An exotic species is the result of direct or indirect, deliberate or accidental introduction of the species by humans. A species is exotic if it occurs outside its historical or natural range. An exotic species is not an integrated member of an ecological community in which it finds itself. It's not participating in the relevant interspecific interactions. Each of these ideas has been sort of offered as a way of sort of articulating what makes a species exotic or invasive. Being a philosopher, I like to sort of, I delight in kind of sort of a bad thing to do, but to poke into the way scientists define their terms, right? And so here are a couple of open-ended questions just to get you thinking. So suppose a species is introduced into an area in which it's not native. Are the daughter species native or exotic? If a species migrates by traveling on, say, on a human by its normal dispersal mechanisms, why should that be thought of as different? So if a seed attaches to my pants leg, but it just as easily could have done it to a bear or a mountain lion or something, then why somehow my doing it morally wrong? How do we specify the historical range in space and time of a species given the difficulties in reconstructing these biogeographical facts? Reconstructing the past is hard enough. Trying to figure out exactly what the historical range of a species can be really, really difficult. According to kind of recent community ecology, we shouldn't think of communities as anything other than sort of individualistic assemblages, a kind of motley crew of species, which is constantly changing in space and time. The idea that there are these well-articulated communities is something that ecologists believed a long time ago, but no longer believe, so we're told. Those are interesting issues. Maybe more to the point, think about this. So some conservation biologists and ecologists claim that exotic species are not necessarily harmful. That is, you can be an exotic species and not necessarily be bad. Why? Well, so the claim goes, is on average the number of successful colonizations of exotics exceeds the extinction of natives. But if exotics were so bad, they'd have to just run all those natives out. An example of this comes from the ecologist James Brown. He kind of collates some data. So after several centuries of European colonization, relatively few native plant species have gone extinct, whereas invading species have approximately doubled the size of island flora. So 2,000 to 4,000 in New Zealand, 1,300 to 2,300 in Hawaii, 221 to 421 on Lord Howe Island, Australia, 500 to 111 on Easter Island, and so on, right? Apparently these exotics aren't so bad. Now, I'm not a scientist, and so you could certainly dispute the data. You might think that the time horizon is too short, etc. But this at least makes you worry that maybe being exotic isn't necessarily bad. Daniel Simbeloff, in response to Brown, says the following. Even if 90% of exotic species don't cause substantial ecological or economic impact, still, quote, 10% of a large number is still a large number. And then he'll cite examples, right? Gary oak woodlands and meadows in the U.S. Pacific Northwest are now seas of Scotch broom. Oaks have replaced the American chestnut in eastern North America. Dead man's fingers carpets much of the seafloor of southern Gulf of Maine and Nova Scotia. Massive monocultures of the Pacific killer alga smother seagrass meadows off the coast of Spain, France, Italy, and Croatia. You can think of, in a way, Simbeloff is articulating kind of a precautionary approach to thinking about exotics and invasives. The last thing I want to say about sort of exotic species or invasive species is philosophers often highlight there's an important difference between facts and values. Right? Facts don't imply values. If you think that facts tell you what you should value, you're committing ominously the naturalistic fallacy, right? You don't want to reason fallaciously. But there seems to be a difference between what is true and what should be the case. In one way that I've tried to think about this is actually being more careful with my terminology. So this is me being sort of persnickety, and you can sort of take my advice or leave it. But I think it's important to distinguish between what you might think of as exotic species and invasive species. So an exotic species is one that's introduced into an area where it didn't previously occur. Right? It occurs in a habitat non-natively. An invasive species is one that you can think of as being exotic, but also tends to become abundant and expand into new areas and is harmful. So it, say, outcompetes the surrounding species. So you can think of every invasive is exotic, but not every exotic is invasive. This is just my way of trying to articulate the difference between the factual and the evaluative. If everything that I've said is right, then we shouldn't just immediately assume that exotic species are necessarily harmful. That is just also to say that introducing exotics needn't always be a bad thing. And so this is to sort of claim that that second idea was too strong. I also think that you might even think that introducing exotic species is not morally wrong, but rather it's imprudent. It's not wise to do it, but it's not, strictly speaking, something that is immoral. This is now me just sort of reflecting on the notion of invasive species. If you think about the criteria that I articulated a bit ago about sort of what makes something exotic, it turns out those criteria apply to us as a species as well. And a kind of one thing to think about is if you have reason to prevent species introductions, you might have the same reasons to prevent humans from invading areas where we are not native. And that's an uncomfortable idea, but... So upshot, introducing species or causing them to go extinct is not necessarily wrong, but depends on the circumstances and the values at stake. So you might put it this way, in environmental ethics we are sometimes thinking too simplistically. So what's the right question to be asking? Well, there's at least one. I don't know that this is the only one to be asking, but given global climate change, is more harm caused by allowing species to go extinct or creating possible invasives through managed relocation or assisted migration? So now it's a question of weighing the relative harms and the benefits. If you're going to introduce a particular species, right, you can't just sort of settle it in sort of absolute terms, but you have to ask, what about the circumstances? What are the relevant values? What are the effects of each policy? So the third idea, human-induced climate change will cause species to go extinct unless we relocate those species to areas outside their native range. So up until this point, I've sort of been, you might think, been opening up the space for actually engaging in assisted migration. So now what I want to do is be a little more pessimistic. If you look at the models that are sort of used to predict where species will do well, sort of envelope models, there's enormous amounts of uncertainty, just scientific uncertainty about where species will do well. One of the things I've been struck by is that even when you have good models, envelope models for individual species, often it's very hard to predict how species will interact when they're introduced into some place they've never been. And given that uncertainty, it seems to me that a tremendous amount of sort of precautionary principle or precautionary approach ought to be taken. So let me talk about this last worry about playing God. So it's wrong that we are playing God with the planet. There's been a lot of discussion in the popular press recently about the idea that we now live in the Anthropocene. If you've read a recent book by Emma Maris, it's sort of what she essentially argues is that the idea of thinking about wild nature over and apart from us is a kind of a relic of an old way of thinking, and it doesn't have much place now. I don't quite know what to make of that yet, but one thing that does seem to be true is that altering the planet is something we simply can't avoid if we're going to be here, right? If you think about the history of our species, be it the sort of role of agriculture, industrial revolution, and so forth, humans have altered the face of the planet. That's inescapable. The question is, I think, and I guess this is certainly a debatable point, is whether every human intervention must necessarily be harmful. So, for example, would assisted migration actually, in particular instances, improve the lot of species that we move? So just by way of conclusion, we can't simply assume introducing species or causing species extinction is morally wrong. We cannot assume that playing God is always wrong either. Human interventions are unavoidable and ideally may rectify past mistakes or may produce more good than harm. That's an assumption. The right question, it seems to me, is given global climate change, is more harm caused by allowing species to go extinct or creating possible invasives through assisted migration, managed relocation? And the last thing is, and I think this is really important, is that question about benefits and harms is an empirical question. It's not something to be settled sort of a priori, right? So that's not something even a philosopher can weigh in on. So, thank you.
We have lots of time for questions. So, there's a question right there.
So I have a question about your both premise 2, the moral to move species, and also the playing God. It seems like, but fundamentally, we must have some sense of the proper morality of moving species for agriculture and for landscaping and and on and on. So that seems, I was questioning your fundamental premise, and then the playing God also, if we really thought that was morally inappropriate, we would never have a surgical intervention on a sick lives and such. So how do you defend those against those premises, against what seems to be the opposite?
So I thought the second case is really useful. It's interesting when I think about. So we are fairly comfortable in thinking about we don't let nature just take its course in the medical context. And I guess the question would be the limitations on that. So so it's sort of, I guess it's interesting that we're in Oregon. So here's a case. So here we have a Death with Dignity Act, and that at the federal level seems to be really controversial. It seems the federal government often wants to sort of weigh in on whether that's constitutional, et cetera. At the margins, I do think it's a difficult issue. So moving species around in the case of assisted migration might be like death with dignity, in the sense that it's at the fringe of what we think is permissible. Alex and I were talking just a little bit ago about if there were technologies by which we could bring back extinct species. Is that the sort of thing that we would be willing to do? Some people just think it's fantastic. That leaves the possibility, and I'm much more pessimistic. So I think that assisted migration is analogous to really cutting-edge medical interventions where we really can't predict which way it's going to go. And that makes it harder to sort of formulate a policy which holds everywhere, kind of every win. It's a good question.
More questions?
Yeah.
So when you're discussing about the precautionary timber law, saying be careful about when you do about this idea of introductions, to combat a lot of certain invasive species, there are introductions for biocontrol, for example, and that's a case where there is belief that the benefits of introducing a weevil or whatever outweigh the potential harm. But it's not just releasing the weevil, it's years and years of trials and testing on congenerics and other species. So there is that kind of principle of multi-year steps to test something before it's brought to a completely new area. So that might be a body of literature to kind of think about too.
Yeah, that's very useful. I mean, the first thing I was thinking of was Australia, right? Talking about biocontrol and introductions and so forth. And you introduce X only to have to introduce Y to deal with X and so forth. So one question that I think is an interesting one, it's outside my expertise, is when would enough be enough in terms of knowing what you needed to know when the risks were minimized, as much as you can reasonably hope for. One of the things that is, I think, sort of important when we make these decisions is sort of the factual element, which is trying to do the experiments or amass the data you need to make that kind of inference. The second is the risk element strikes me as a issue about values and about ethics, and we as a society, in some sense, have to articulate how much risk we're willing to tolerate. A particular intervention will be a product of both. On the one hand, how much certainty you have, and then on the other, how big are the relative risks. So, as a philosopher, it's the sort of thing I can sort of point at and go, there's a problem. But in some sense, this is where the scientists help fill in the gap and say, well, here's what we know. Yeah.
I think, too, when I think about the question of assisted migration, or really any kind of management intervention against climate change, we're looking at the problem on this human time frame. And, what's to say that on an evolutionary time frame that really what we're doing and have been doing for the past century or more is just setting the stage for the next adaptive evolution.
Yeah. One of the people who are fans of rewilding, who are fans of bringing back extinct species and so on. My worry is that we have a kind of nostalgia for the past, that we try to sort of bury that nostalgia in other terms. But And who wouldn't want a woolly mammoth, right, as a pet, I guess, I don't know, right? You know, I think people who are especially sort of kind of grassroots support for assisted migration, it has to do with a kind of biophilia for a particular species, and that's of course perfectly fine in a lot of ways, but that may not be justification enough. One of the things that's striking to me is that in restoration ecology, for example, there are innumerable past moments one can use to figure out what you're going to restore a particular place to. It's an ethical question as why you'd pick any one of those. Why is that the right time? And so assisted migration gets wrapped up with that. So we want to move a species. Well, why? We want to protect it. Well, then you start asking questions about the assemblage of which it would be a part, and you know, so you might think that you're changing the landscape in a way that's not historically accurate. Is that nostalgia? Is that something else?
It also gets to the idea that somehow we're outside of nature.
This is what I think people, when they're talking about the sort of the Anthropocene, are really onto, is that there's, you know, if you go back in sort of environmental literature, well, you go all the way back to sort of, you know, one way you can think about it is in terms of sort of the kind of core religious text that we sort of have as a part of our culture. There's, on the one side, there's the human, on the other side, there's the non-human. Post-Darwin, we have to rethink that in a certain way. And so I think that, this is just my own kind of reporting, kind of how I think about it. I think it's hard to think of ourselves as exceptional in nature in the sense of we are outside of nature. We're part of nature. But that doesn't mean that what we do is not different. Right? We obviously are having impacts that are different than other species on the planet. It's not a difference in kind, but a difference in degree. And I think we have to think about ourselves in those terms. Yeah, that's good.
You mentioned that some of your students kind of agree with the intrinsic value position, and this is a good follow-up to the previous discussion. How do they get around the idea that, you know, any view that we might have, or any value we might have, is originating from us, from humans? So is it by definition?
That's good. So you should have been in my class a couple days ago, right, when you could push them on this. The one way I think that it's helpful to think about that issue is this. So I think it's, you know, there might be other species that value things, right, but we might be the only one that does. I think when we're thinking about intrinsic value, one useful way of thinking about it is, it's not that the issue of intrinsic value is not settled by the fact that we do the valuing. The question is, what is it that we come to value and why? So it might be true that only humans value things, but ask yourself, you know, if you are committed ecologists, say, you know, why do you do the work that you do? You might say, well, because I just really love wild nature, say. And someone says, but is that intrinsic value? You say, well, sure. But if you didn't value, there wouldn't be value, or something. They might say something like that. The thing that you might think is, you know, fair enough, but what I value is not merely human use of a species, but rather I want it to exist for its own sake. So some people distinguish between anthropocentric values and another term they use is anthropogenic values. Anthropogenic values are ones that are values that we have, but they're only concerning our well-being. A non-anthropocentric view could say, yeah, we're the only ones that value, but the things that we value are outside us, but the world around us and so forth. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the students, what I say is that you can think that nature has intrinsic value because those are the kinds of things you're committed to, and you don't care about whether or not it's beneficial to you. But it's the sort of thing in the same way that I might care about family members or friends. I care about them not for my sake, but for theirs.
I think I saw another question in the back there.
Yeah.
And this might be better for all the speakers too, is I kind of find it hard to imagine. I mean, it's almost a scare tactic, some of the stuff we're talking about. You bring Scotch broom over here X number of years ago, it spreads, it kind of a fire, and it seems to set in people's mind. Moving a species 50 miles or 100 miles, I have a hard time imagining one species. I'd like to see some case examples where that's happened, where it's become a Scotch broom type of thing. a lot of the insect predators and whatever too are probably going to want to creep with it. And so, you know, I think there's data that can be pulled together and various other things at some point to maybe make local distant migration as opposed to these continental jumps or wide jumps as well too.
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way to scare someone is to pick small samples, you know, and make them unrepresentative, right? So all of a sudden, here's a horrible case, but why assume that all the other cases of assisted migration, for example, would be like that? The only thing that only reason why I think the bad cases might be important is that, as they say, you sort of don't make policy on the basis of, you know, individual cases. But on the other hand, you don't want your policy to be kind of insensitive to the extremum, you know, the cases. So, but I take your point.
Maybe time for one more question. So, of course, your suggestion that all invasives are exotic. I'm just curious about it. There's in some of the writing that, you know, what we might expect from climate change. Some people write that perhaps some natives may become invasive. And I'm not totally sure. I assume that what they mean by that is it become much more prevalent and maybe to the exclusion of other species. But do you think about that, and how do you classify that? That's an interesting suggestion. So the way I put it was you could distinguish exotics and invasive. Exotics are not harmful, invasives. But of course, there's no reason you have to stay in one of those bins. You can presumably move. And I don't know, I'd have to look at the empirical literature and see how likely it is that a non-native species will make the transition to being, you know, over an evolutionary time frame, sort of being harmful, et cetera. It's a great question.
So just like the prime example of that is poison ivy. So poison ivy responds really well to elevated CO2 levels. A lot of people probably know that. So that's the native that is cited a lot as becoming the most prevalent problem.
Because then even if you said, yeah, sure, that can make, you know, just because it's exotic doesn't mean it's invasive. But if there's a high probability that you'll go from one to the other, then that's important.
But wouldn't all species be invasive under the right conditions?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, under the right conditions, right? And certainly all species, insofar as they migrate, are going to be exotic eventually, right? They'll move outside their native range. Give them enough geological time. So, I mean, this is the other thing about it is that we have a tendency, this is sort of the human perspective, when we think about things like the worries about invasive or exotics, we're thinking about it in a relatively small time frame, namely hours.